The following program, General Grant looks at the American Civil War, The Road to War, Part 4, is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network. It is one of that series of programs wherein General Grant lifts up a person, place, or event in the war for review and reflection. It is available on the free YouTube channel Dr. E.C. Fields, on Facebook under Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and other social media. Permission to copy and distribute is granted and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. And now, General Grant looks at the American Civil War, The Road to War, Part 4, the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry, and the firing on Fort Sumter. I am General Ulysses S. Grant, General of the Armies, and I welcome you here in the library where we shall reflect tonight on the fourth and final part of the series, The Road to War. And tonight I am going to look at John Brown and his raid on Harper's Ferry and the firing on Fort Sumter when the war actually began. John Brown was born sometime in 1800, specifically unknown, and he died on December 2nd of 1859 when he was hanged by the neck until dead, having been convicted of treason against the state of Virginia and murder and other charges. He had been an abolitionist all his life, grew up in an abolitionist family. His family had moved around to several states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. He had come to reside in North Elba, New York, a black farming community, free black farming community. In fact, when he lived in Ohio, northern Ohio, my father had lived with his family while father was apprenticed to a tanner learning the tanning business. John, as I recall, was about 8 or 9 years old at the time. But he moved around a lot. When he became an adult, he still moved around a good bit. He was married twice. He had 20 children. He fathered 20 children. He pursued his abolitionist, anti-slavery feelings. He was a failure at everything he tried to do. He had declared bankruptcy. He became involved with the anti-slavery movement, becoming something of an organizer and moving around the North and Northeast raising funds for the anti-slavery movement. He developed the plot of fomenting a slave rebellion and finally came to focus on Harper's Ferry Federal Arsenal and Armory. It had been started actually by George Washington in 1794, and it's at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers. Militarily, it is totally indefensible, but apparently John wasn't thinking much about that. He was looking for the factors of arms, and there were 100,000 arms at that armory, or the arsenal part of it. He wanted a place to live and to hide, and he was planning to use the Appalachian Mountains running from Alabama all the way up into Virginia and further to have a series of way stations where groups of men would help slaves to get north to freedom. He also knew that there were approximately 18,000 slaves in the six-county area around the Harpers Ferry Armory, and he apparently felt that they would be the nucleus of the army and the rebellion that he was hoping to start. He rented a farm, the Kennedy Farm, about 5 miles from Harper's Ferry, and trained there some 21 people, and trained there to make the assault. And on the night of October the 16th of 59, he advanced late at night. He advanced on Harper's Ferry. They crossed the Baltimore and Ohio covered bridge at that time, wooden covered bridge, and took the guard on the bridge. But the first mistake that they made for the night, they let him escape. So he's going to put out the alarm. And he actually stopped the train before it got into the station. Hayward Shepherd was a free black man working at the train station and became suspicious of what was happening and walked out into the darkness along the railroad track to try to find out what was happening. And the Brown group made the second mistake of the evening. They shot and killed Mr. Shepherd. A free black man becomes the first victim of the John Brown raid to free slaves. And of course, with the shots ringing out, any hope of secrecy and surprise was gone. And his followers went to get a local doctor. They found a Dr. Starry, Starry, unusual name, but Dr. Starry was brought to treat Hayward and he died. Well, they let Dr. Starry go with the promise not to say anything. And of course, he became known as the Paul Revere of Harper's Ferry and rode into the neighboring towns, putting out the alarm that the arsenal was being taken. And that in turn set out the local militia who came in early the next morning. So Brown and followers went into Harper's Ferry, kidnapped some 11 local officials that they were going to hold for ransom, and they had to move into the firehouse there, the brick building, which became their fort and later known as John Brown's Fort. The militia had them bottled up, gunfire, people were killed, and in fact the mayor of Harper's Ferry was shot and killed. He got too close and paid for it with his life. When the news got to Washington, President Buchanan dispatched a group of some 90 Marines from the Navy Yards there in command or commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. And Captain Jeb Stewart, who happened to be in Washington on personal business at the time, volunteered to go, and he became second in command to Colonel Lee. They got to Harper's Ferry about midnight on the 17th, tried to talk with them. Brown refused to negotiate, and it was decided that the Marines were going to break in, but since there were hostages, there was to be no gunshots. So the Marines had to break in the door, and they got a sledgehammer, they got a ladder for a ram, pounded and beat on the door, and finally got an opening big enough for one man to go through. And the lieutenant commanding the detachment volunteered to go through first. And he gets in and tries to stab Brown with his sword, but Brown was wearing a breastplate under his coat, and it bent the lieutenant's sword. But by this time, other Marines had come in through the opening, and Brown and party, the survivors, one of his own sons, had been killed in the exchange of gunfire, and they surrendered. Brown was taken prisoner, whisked off to, I believe it was Charlestown, Virginia, now West Virginia, and held in jail there, and was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to be hanged on December the 2nd. And he made some statements that I should like to share with you while he was in the jail. He said, "Whereas slavery throughout its entire existence in the United States is none other than a most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens upon another portion, the only conditions of which are perpetual imprisonment and hopeless servitude or absolute extermination, in utter disregard and violation of those eternal and self-evident truths set forth in our Declaration of Independence. He also said, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust reenactments, I submit, so let it be done. And as he was being escorted to the gallows, he slipped a note into the hand of his jailer who let him out of his cell. And the note, his last words, were these: I am quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. His last note. Now, Frederick Douglass, who had become a friend of John Brown's, they met many times. In fact, he was invited to be a part of this raid at a secret meeting in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, not long before the raid. He declined that privilege and told Brown it was walking into a steel trap. But Brown would hear none of it. And he had also been made a hero, and perhaps he was listening to that. After the Pottawatomie raid, he met Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, and they were lionizing him in the press and in their writings, making him a hero, making him a wonderful man who could lead people to freedom. They conveniently overlooked the brutality of the murders, the 5 murders at Pottawatomie Creek, the murder of the slave owner not long after that when he freed 11 slaves. But Thoreau said he was the essence of a transcendentalist. He was given dignity and a mantle of righteousness in New England, all the while not discussing the brutal acts that he'd committed. So he became a hero. He became a martyr by being hanged, but he was, as I said, lionized in the press by the New England elite anti-slavery society in Boston and in Philadelphia. The wealthy picked him up. He was a doll of the wealthy. Quite the character in upper crust New England society and anti-slavery society. But Frederick Douglass said this about him: with John Brown, as with every other man fit to die for a cause, the hour of his physical weakness was the hour of his moral strength. The hour of his defeat was the hour of his triumph. The moment of his capture was the crowning victory of his life. With the Allegheny Mountains for his pulpit, the country for his church, and the whole civilized world for his audience, he was 1,000 times more effective as a preacher than as a warrior. And the consciousness of this fact was the secret of his amazing complacency. Mighty with the sword of steel, he was mightier with the sword of truth. With this sword, he literally swept the horizon. He was more than a match for all the Wises, Masons, Van Landinghams, and Washingtons who could rise against him. They could kill him, but they could not answer him. But the question is, did John Brown fail? He certainly did fail to get out of Harper's Ferry before being beaten down by United States soldiers. He did fail to save his own life and to lead a liberating army into the mountains of Virginia, but he did not go to Harper's Ferry to save his life. The true question is, did John Brown draw his sword against slavery and thereby lose his life in vain? No. To this I answer 10,000 times, no. No man fails or can fail who so grandly gives himself and all he has to a righteous cause. No man who in his hour of extremest need, when on his way to meet an ignominious death, could so forget himself as to stop and kiss a little child, one of the hated race for whom he was about to die, could by any possibility fail. Did John Brown fail? Ask Henry A. Wise, in whose house, less than 2 years after, a school for the emancipated slaves was taught. Did John Brown fail? Ask James M. Mason, the author of the inhuman Fugitive Slave Bill, who was cooped up in Fort Warren as a traitor less than 2 years from the time that he stood over John Brown's prostrated body. Did John Brown fail? Ask Clement Van Landingham, one other of the inquisitorial party, for he too went down in the tremendous whirlpool created by the powerful hand of the bold invader. If John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery. If we look over the dates, places, and men for which this honor is claimed, we shall find that not Carolina, but Virginia, not Fort Sumter, but Harper's Ferry, and the Arsenal, not Colonel Anderson, but John Brown, began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. The irrepressible conflict was one of words, votes, and compromises. When John Brown stretched forth his arm, the sky was cleared. The time for compromises was gone. The armed hosts of freedom stood face to face over the chasm of a broken union, and the clash of arms was at hand. The South staked all upon getting possession of the federal government, and failing to do that, drew the sword of rebellion and thus made her own, and not Brown's, the lost cause of the century. He too lionized John Brown, and I should like to, in reflecting, lift up again that John Brown committed some acts of brutal and heinous savagery, but that was overlooked by people eager to find a martyr, and he was martyred by being hanged. The North loved him, he was their darling. The South hated him and described him to be the devil incarnate. The North apparently justified the ends by the means by the ends, and the South was just outraged. So the Harper's Ferry raid by John Brown was a failure at the moment and the time. But John Brown could never have imagined what would ultimately happen, and his raid on Harper's Ferry Arsenal was a touchstone for the flames that erupted. It was like striking a match, and it was one of the very significant stepping stones to war, because by the time he had committed that raid, even though he failed, as Mr. Douglass says, the chasm between the two sides had widened to the point that there was no crossing it. Now, the firing on Fort Sumter When President Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, he had not even had an opportunity to get into office when on December 20th, South Carolina seceded. And several more states by the 1st of February, some 7 states had seceded from the Union and more to go. But Lincoln's thinking there were a total of 15 slave states, only 8 had gone out, and he was still hoping to hold the Union together. The southern states were taking control of the arsenals and federal military installations in their states. And Lincoln was trying to hold on to what he could and yet not spark a fight. In South Carolina, there were 3 forts: Fort Johnson, Fort Moultrie, and Fort Sumter, which is built in the middle of the bay on an artificial island, started in 1829, and by 1860, it still isn't completed. It was one of the 3rd level fort, some 3 stories high, and brick casemate, 5-sided fort with mounting some 100 guns, most of them facing the ocean, which became useless when the enemy was behind them in Charleston. In November of 1860, Major Robert Anderson, the 1st Artillery, was sent there to be the commander, and he was sent there because he was a Southerner. He was a West Point graduate, distinguished himself in the Black Hawk War, Seminole Wars, Mexican War on assistant adjutant on General Scott's staff, had been wounded at Molino del Rey, and had, after the Mexican War, distinguished himself and was quite the career officer. He was a Southerner, and it was felt that he might be a good or the best choice to command the forces in Charleston Harbor. Governor Pickens of South Carolina was demanding that the fort be turned over to them, to the Confederate States. In January 61, the Star of the West was sent there to resupply. No weapons, no soldiers, only foodstuffs and supplies, and they were fired on by the Citadel artillery unit, students from the Citadel, and it turned away. As tensions rose, Major Anderson, who only had 85 men in the garrison and with some of their families, moved from Fort Moultrie, an 1812 fortress, into Fort Sumter the night of December 26th. And this, of course, outraged the Confederacy. And he was very short on supplies. He knew he only had supplies to last until mid-April. And Jefferson Davis sent Pierre Gustave de Beauregard to be in command of those forces in Charleston, the batteries and so forth, some 40 guns, had about 500 troops. There were some 3,500 Confederate troops in the area. And they're facing an unfinished Fort Sumter. Anderson was able to get about 50 of those guns up, 50 or so, but he didn't have the troops to man them. And he was in a very difficult situation, and he knew it. He knew it was only a matter of time. Jefferson Davis told Beauregard to get him to surrender, if necessary, fire on him and take the fort. And on the 11th of April, Beauregard sends word out to entreaty to surrender. And there, one of the ironies of the war, Beauregard had been an artillery student under Major Robert Anderson when he was teaching artillery at West Point. In fact, Beauregard was such an expert student that Anderson had him come back after graduation and teach assistant instructor in artillery for a year. So they were well acquainted, if not friends, former teacher and student. And now Beauregard he's the first general in the Confederacy, was made a brigadier general when he resigned from the Army. And he's asking Anderson for a surrender, and Anderson refused. At 4:30 in the morning on April the 12th, The signal shot was fired, mortar shot burst over the fort, and all three of the installations around Fort Sumter opened fire. And in the next 34 hours, some 3,000 artillery rounds were fired at Fort Sumter, most of them hitting their mark. They were well sighted in. Anderson finally surrendered on the 13th, about 2:30 in the afternoon, because he was afire. The Armory was was on fire, and he couldn't fight fires and fight the Confederacy. He was running low, only had a few days more of food and water, so he sent word to his former student Beauregard that he wanted to surrender, and the next day they struck the flag and marched out and boarded a boat in the harbor and went to the SS Baltic off Sandy Hook, and from thence to New York. Now, in his surrender, the telegram he sent Secretary of War Cameron reads as follows: SS Baltic, off Sandy Hook, April 18th, 10:30 a.m. via New York. Honorable S. Cameron, Secretary of War, Washington. Having defended Fort Sumter for 34 hours until the quarters were entirely burned, the main gates destroyed by fire, the gorge walls seriously injured, the magazine surrounded by flames, and its door closed from the effects of heat, 4 barrels and 3 cartridges of powder only being available, and no provisions remaining except pork. I accepted terms of evacuation offered by General Beauregard, being the same offered by him on the 11th instant prior to the commencement of hostilities, and marched out of the fort Sunday afternoon, the 14th instant, with colors flying and drums beating, bringing away company and private property, and saluting my flag with 50 guns. Robert Anderson, Major, 1st Artillery Commanding. The irony of this battle, the firing on Fort Sumter, 34 hours of shelling, 3,000 rounds fired at the fort, many fired back from the fort to the batteries firing at them. No one was killed. The only people who were killed were 2 federal soldiers during that 50-gun salute as they were preparing to leave. A gun exploded and killed 2 soldiers. And there was 1 Confederate horse killed in Charleston. And those were the only casualties in the battle that started the American Civil War. It's a shame that those low casualty rates did not sustain through the war, but sadly they did not. So the road to war was begun, and the war was on April the 12th of 1861, when Major Robert Anderson, 1st Artillery Commanding, surrendered the fort then on April 14th. Cooler heads should have prevailed, but by the time John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, cooler heads could not prevail. Anger replaced reason, and emotion replaced thought and debate. So the war was on. This has been a 4-part series where I have looked at and lifted up some of the stones in the path and the road to war. And as I said from the first, it was not intended to be exclusive or all-inclusive. There are other steps that were taken, but I've lifted up what I felt to be the major ones, and hope that they've been a source of reflection and information for you. But for this moment, here in the library, I have said quite enough. I am pleased that you've enjoyed and stayed with the 4-part series. There will be more reflections to come in the future. But for the moment, I'm General of the Army's Ulysses S. Grant, bidding you an affectionate farewell.